Okay, good morning, everybody, or good evening, depending on when you're watching this. Our church is going through and talking about the significance of Jesus Christ, who he is, his person, his relationship to God. And we've been going through a variety of passages. Particularly, I've been talking about one of the ways in which the New Testament writers portrayed Jesus, and that is portraying Jesus in terms of God's wisdom. And this is what specialists and scholars call wisdom Christology. We've seen its origins in the book of Proverbs. We've seen scattering of it in Matthew, Luke, John, 1 Corinthians, Hebrews, and today we're going to look at Colossians chapter 1. So without further ado, we can get started. All right. Just make sure, by the way, that that you have your mics muted. Okay. There we go. Now we should be good. Okay. So we're going to look at this passage in Colossians. It's only 6 verses. I say it's only 6 verses, but this is not necessarily easy stuff. So it's complex, but I trust that the Lord wants to reveal himself to people that want to learn. So if you want to learn, and if we're humble and if we're meek, then God is able to teach us. And so I trust that God is going to make that which is confusing clear to us. So let's start by looking at the passage. I've only made I think I only translated 2 words differently here than what the NASB does. And I'll talk about that as well. So here, Colossians 1:15 through 20, which talks about Jesus. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. For in him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. He is also the head of the body, the church. He is the ruler, the firstborn of the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in all things. For it was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him, and through him to reconcile all things to himself, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. So regardless of how we go and interpret the specifics of this, let me tell you, this is making an awful lot of exalted statements about Jesus, okay? You can't, let's not sit there and say he's just a man. I mean, Jesus is the most exalted created thing in God's universe. He is the number 2 person in all of the world. And I tend to find that biblical Unitarians are uncomfortable with this passage. They tend to shy away from it, or they don't want to talk about it. I don't think I've ever heard a sermon on it. But I would like us to be able to say, okay, if this is what God is saying, something that we need to learn, then we need to get comfortable with it, because if we get comfortable with it, we can understand what God has done through Jesus and the significance of Jesus, that person in whom we place our faith and trust. Okay, so we have that section is actually called it's a hymn, HYMN, meaning it's a song, and it can be broken up like many songs. Any of you that play music know that you have stanzas and the chorus, and you have different ways that the song is divided. And so scholars have looked at this, and they've really tried to divide out the way that this functions as a hymn, as a song. And I'm going to try to show that to you, but this is a little bit complicated, so just bear with me, and hopefully we'll get through this all. So, by the way, the word strophe, I kind of did a straw man poll, and I learned that most people don't know what a strophe is. A strophe is a stanza in a Greek hymn, okay? So you can see that the very first stanza is going to be verses 15 through 16, and you'll see how this works. And then that's kind of a main section. And then what we're going to do is it's going to move into a transition period. The first stanza seems to be talking about creation, where it talks about firstborn, all things were created, heavens and the earth, visible or invisible. It lists 4 different things. All things have been made through him and for him. We transition from creation to redemption, being before all things. In him, all things hold together. He's the head of the body of the church. And then we move into the redemption strophe, where it starts talking about redemption. The ruler, the firstborn of the dead. He comes to have first place in all things. God's pleasure for the fullness to dwell in him. He has reconciled all things to himself. He has made peace through the blood of the cross, the things that are in the earth and the things that are in the heaven. And so the important thing actually to see is that these 2 strophes here, the one about creation, the one about redemption, actually are going to have parallel points on lines going all the way down. Now, it's difficult to see this in English, but what I might be able to do is I might be able to demonstrate this by looking at the original language. And I'm aware that that many people here are not able to read this in Greek. But I highlighted some of the words, and hopefully you'll be able to see. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep this format here, where we got the creation strophe, verses 15 through 16, a transition period that goes from 17 through the first half of 18, and then the redemption strophe from the last half of 18 all the way through 20. I'm going to take the English there, and I'm just going to simply replace it with Greek, and I'm going to show you how some of the lines pick up, and hopefully you'll be able to see this. Okay. So all we did was we've replaced the English with the original language. You got the same format, but you'll probably be able to see some things that look relatively similar. In the first line, we have this phrase, os estin, which means he is. So you get he is on the left and he is on the right. So you can see how there's a parallel that's going on there. You can see in the second line, we have the word for firstborn, prototokos. You can see that in the first line. You can see it on the left and you can see it on the right. Okay. Third line, we have in him, and then we have the word for all on the left, and then we have in him and the word for all on the right in the third line. Okay. Then we have 3 phrases that all show up on the same line. We have tapanta, which means the things. Okay. We have that on both sides. We have theoptu, which means through him. We have that on both sides. And we have is afton, which means in him. So all 3 of those phrases show up on both sides at a similar portion of the strophe. And then we could actually look at the very, very beginning. So if you notice it on the left, verses 15 through 16, we have a phrase which says, in the heavens and upon the earth. So that happens at the very, very beginning of the hymn. We have in the heavens and on the earth. And then at the very, very end, in the last sentence, basically, we have upon the earth and in the heavens. So basically, we start off with in the heavens and we end with in the heavens. And then in the middle, we have upon the earth, and then we have upon the earth. And so it kind of has an A, B, B, A structure to it. So you can see that there's poetic arrangement, there's a deliberate organization to it, but it's much easier to demonstrate it by setting up the stanzas of the hymn in this manner than it is to just put the text up there in English. So that's going to help us to see what's actually going on here. But first of all, we need to ask the very, very, very important question. What is Paul's theology in regard to God's wisdom in Jesus? Okay. Now I've talked about this before, so I'm not going to go into all the detail, but this is a little bit review. But if you do not understand this particular slide, then everything else that I say is not going to make any sense. That's very, very, very important. Okay. So let's look at what we have going on here. Okay, so Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10 what many interpreters have guessed, and that Jesus Christ is a type of God's personified wisdom, okay? In 1 Corinthians 10, Paul tells us that Jesus is a type of God's wisdom, okay? So we're dealing with typology. So here's the passage, and here's the logic behind the passage. 1 Corinthians 10, starting in verse 1. I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and they were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and they all ate the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink. Here's the important part. But they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and the rock was Christ. The rock was Christ. He goes on 2 verses later, and he says, now these things happened as types for us. Your English translation will say examples, but it's the word typos, types, so that we would not crave the evil things that they craved. And then 5 verses later, he says in verse 11, now these things happened to them typologically. Okay, so twice in this passage, Paul tells us that he is teaching us typologically. What does he do? He says that our fathers, including the Gentiles in Corinth, their fathers were in the wilderness. Okay, well, how can a Gentile's ancestors be Israelites in the wilderness? Well, he's like, hey, we were all baptized into Moses. We ate spiritual food. We ate spiritual drink. You can see the baptism and the spiritual food indicating the Christian sacraments there. But what he says there is that, hey, they were drinking from a spiritual rock, and that rock was Christ. Okay? The rock was Christ. Now, the widespread Jewish interpretation was that the rock in the wilderness was God's personified wisdom. And I demonstrated that in a previous teaching. I put the passages in Sirach, Wisdom of Solomon, and Philo, where they interpret that the rock was wisdom. Okay, so they would say that, reading 1 Corinthians 10:4, they were drinking from the same spiritual rock that followed them, and that wisdom rock was Christ. That wisdom was Christ. They interpreted the rock as wisdom. So take away the word rock, put in the word wisdom, and that's how Jews are interpreting it. Okay, so Paul interprets Lady Wisdom as a type of Christ. It's very important. Again, Paul is able to say, hey, look, the rock was Christ. If the rock was interpreted as wisdom, then what Jesus is actually saying is that, hey, wisdom was Christ. That's what he's saying there. But he's speaking as a type. He's speaking typologically. Paul doesn't think that Jesus is a rock. So, within the sphere of typology, Paul can say things that, if interpreted as literal statements, would sound like Paul was saying the Israelites, would sound like Christ was with the Israelites as a rock. You see that? You see how, if you were to read 10 verse 4 literally, it sounds like Paul is saying Jesus is a rock. Okay? No interpreter thinks that Jesus is a rock. No interpreter thinks that. Okay? So, clearly, interpreting that literally is not the right way to go. Okay? But Paul tells us in the passage that he is not speaking literally. He's speaking in types. He's speaking typologically. Okay? But typology is not to be read as if two things are equated. Okay? Again, if the rock was interpreted as wisdom, then Paul is saying that wisdom was Christ. That's the typology that Paul has. Paul understands the relationship between wisdom and Jesus typologically. And if it's typological, then it's not equating the two as if one is the other. Okay? I'll give you another example of typology that Paul uses. Romans chapter 5. Paul says that Adam, the first human being, was a type of Jesus, a type of the one to come. That's what Paul says. Adam was a type of Christ. Are Adam and Jesus the same person? Obviously not. Nobody thinks that. Okay? There is an interesting relationship between the two of them. You can understand one a little bit better by understanding the other. There are some similarities. Okay? You can see that Jesus is kind of the climax, the prototype of the new humanity, but Jesus isn't Adam. Okay, so you can see that typology there would not equate the two things. Okay, so how does Paul understand the relationship between wisdom and Jesus? The answer is typological, not understanding them as if the two are equated. Very important. Okay, so when we look at Colossians 1:15, the modern consensus of specialists on the book of Colossians is that the hymn in verses 15 through 20 is portraying Christ by using descriptions formerly said about God's personified wisdom. Okay? So, if Colossians 1, I'll call the hymn Colossians 1. even though it's just 15 through 20. If Colossians 1 is a hymn that is taking things that were said about wisdom and now using them about Jesus, then the way that you read the hymn has to be typological, because that is Paul's interpretive strategy when he is talking about Jesus and wisdom. We have to read this hymn typologically. Since Paul's interpretive strategy for depicting Jesus in terms of wisdom is typology, we need to be very careful to not read these wisdom statements too literally. That would betray the way in which typology functioned among biblical writers. Again, Paul says that Adam is a type of Christ. You don't equate Jesus and Adam. They're not the same thing. Furthermore, Colossians 1:15 through 20 is a hymn. And hymns are poetic arrangements that are meant to be read and sung as colorful poetry, okay? So, for one, we're reading typology. Two, we're reading a song, a hymn, that is poetically arranged. So that's two reasons why you don't want to read this material too woodenly literal. I think a lot of the problems in interpreting this passage is that people have not approached it recognizing it's a hymn and recognizing that Paul is speaking typologically. And when you read hymnic poetry and typology, you have to read it very carefully. You don't read it woodenly literal like you're reading a business contract. No less than 9 descriptions of Lady Wisdom, of Lady Wisdom are brought forth and applied to Jesus Christ in this hymn. 9 of them, we'll find them. By depicting Jesus in terms of wisdom, Paul seeks to highlight the supreme importance of this exalted human being who's now the promoted ruler over all things. Here's kind of the main point. Christ has taken over the role formerly belonging to wisdom. So, those who are seeking wisdom should look to the man Jesus Christ. We can read through the book of Proverbs, and Proverbs says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and we need to seek after wisdom, and we need to find wisdom, and we need to listen to wisdom and listen to wisdom's words and wisdom's commands. And you could ask yourself, well, how do I do that? The New Testament answer is that if you're looking for wisdom, look to Jesus. Jesus is where you're going to find wisdom. Okay, so let's look at each verse. Verse 15. Okay, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. Okay. All right, so we got to talk about each of these particular points. Let's talk about the image. When it's so the subject there is Jesus. Okay, Jesus is the image of the invisible God. But prior to the writing of this hymn, Lady Wisdom was defined as the image of God, using the same Greek noun ikon. Okay, so here's what I'm going to do is going to play out and put the references that show that wisdom was formerly being said of all of these things that are being said in this hymn, to show that Paul is taking wisdom descriptions and using them now to refer to Jesus. But again, he is doing it with hymnic poetry and using typology. Okay, so 2 passages here that are Jewish sources that predate the New Testament. First one here from Wisdom of Solomon, where it says, she, wisdom, is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. Lady Wisdom is God's image. And then Philo says that he called that divine and heavenly wisdom by many names, and he made it manifest that it had many appellations, and he called it the ruler and the image and the sight of God. So we have 2 Jewish writers that are talking about Lady Wisdom and saying that she is an image of God, and now Paul is taking that image of wisdom and applying it to Jesus. It's important to understand in our passage that Jesus is distinguished from the unseen God. You see that in the first part there at the top? He is the image of the invisible God, okay? Jesus was clearly seen by many people, while God is described as invisible, okay? God is the invisible God. He's the unseen God, but hundreds, thousands of people saw Jesus, okay? So Jesus is not the invisible God. Jesus is the image of the invisible God, okay? While the invisible God was experienced formally in his wisdom, Jesus is the climax of wisdom. Okay, so God was kind of the God that was off in heaven. You know, how would you experience God? Well, you would experience God by God's wisdom, by God's commands, by God's good creation, by his ordered and good creation. But now we can experience, the whole point of saying that Jesus is the image of the invisible God is that if we want to experience the invisible God, whom we can't see, then we need to look to Jesus, who is now the image of that invisible God. Okay. And then it talks about the firstborn of all creation. And I think some people have had trouble with this because they look at this on face value and they say, well, how in the world could Jesus be the firstborn of all creation? But again, reading this literally is not the way that it's supposed to work. It's to be read in the poetry of a hymn and typologically, because formally, wisdom was said to be the firstborn of all creation. So look here in Proverbs, Lady Wisdom says about herself, chapter 8, verse 22. She says, Yahweh possessed me, that's Yahweh possessed wisdom, at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. From everlasting, I was established. From the beginning, from the earliest times of the earth, when there are no depths, I was brought forth. When there are no springs abounding with water, before the mountains were settled, before the hills, I was brought forth. Okay, so who was the firstborn of all creation? Well, if you look in the Old Testament, you would say it's wisdom. Okay, notice how wisdom, by the way, distinguishes herself from Yahweh. Wisdom is not Yahweh. Wisdom is not the creator. Yahweh is the creator, and Yahweh created wisdom. Okay, and then Philo says much of the same in his passage where he talks about Genesis. He says, and who is to be considered the daughter of God but wisdom, who is the firstborn mother of all things. And Philo says that in two of his documents. So in Judaism, prior to the writing of Colossians, wisdom was the firstborn of all creation. And now Paul takes those terms about wisdom and applies them to Jesus. And the point there is that wisdom's preeminent position is now to be found in Jesus Christ. That's the purpose of taking that, okay? Being the firstborn is something that puts you in a preeminent position, okay? The firstborn son is a preeminent position in the family, okay? So now that preeminent position is now to be found in Jesus. Okay, verse 16. For in him all things were created, both in the heavens and on the earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers and authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. Okay. So it's very, very important that we make this point. Please pay attention. God, the sole creator, created all things in or with his personified wisdom. So if you read that at the very beginning, at the top, it says, in him all things were created. That were created there, that's called the passive tense. It's what's typically used when God is the creator, but they don't want to say the name of God out of respect. So they don't say that God created all things in him. They say in him all things were created. They use the passive tense to not use the name of God. But the point there is that God is the creator and God created all things through him, or as we're going to see, through his wisdom. Okay? So the point of God creating with this wisdom, I mean, that's pretty prominently stated in the Old Testament. Psalm 104, verse 24. By the way, if these passages are not underlined and highlighted in your Bible, you have to do that. These are extremely important. Psalm 104, verse 24 says, "O Yahweh, how many are your works? In wisdom, you have made them all." Okay, so who made them all? Was it wisdom? No, it was Yahweh who made them in his wisdom or with his wisdom. Okay, look in Proverbs 3:19. Yahweh in wisdom founded the earth. In understanding, he established the heavens. Okay, so Yahweh's the creator, and God does it through the instrument, through the agent of his wisdom. What is God's wisdom? It's his wise ordering of creation. To say that God created through his wisdom means that God created purposefully, methodically, and with understanding. There's also a passage of it in Wisdom chapter 9, verses 1 through 2, but we've got the two passages here that make the point, okay? So saying that in him all things were created is, again, saying something that was formerly said about wisdom and now applying it to Jesus, okay? Doesn't mean that Jesus is wisdom, because that would be to misunderstand how typology works. Okay? To be clear, wisdom is not the creator. God is the creator. God created in his wisdom, meaning that God created wisely and orderly. Okay? So this passage, in him all things were created, that does not mean that Jesus is the creator. No, it means that God is the creator, and God created all things through wisdom, and now wisdom is now typologically applied to Jesus. That's what the passage means. If you have, by the way, if you have a Bible that says by him all things were created, that's just wrong. It's not even ambiguous. It doesn't mean by him. It means in him. In him all things were created, just like we see in the Old Testament in Psalm 104 and Proverbs chapter 3. God created in wisdom. Okay. Now, it says that all things were created in the heavens, on the earth, the visible and invisible. Okay. I've heard some biblical Unitarians say, well, all things doesn't really mean all things. Okay, well, I don't know how you get a much more all-encompassing statement as what you have there in verse 16. All things is all-encompassing. It basically says, look, the things in the heavens and on the earth, where else could things be? Like if you look at Genesis 1:1, where it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The heavens and the earth is an all-encompassing statement in Genesis 1:1 to mean God created everything. Okay, so in him all things are created, the things in the heavens and on the earth, whether you could see them or whether you can't see them, the visible or in the invisible. And that includes thrones or dominions or rulers or authority. All things have been created through him and for him. That's an all-encompassing statement without any qualification. Okay? So, talk about Lady Wisdom. Lady Wisdom is the, notice we got the talk there about thrones. Lady Wisdom was the possessor of the thrones, dominions, rulers, and authorities, according to the Book of Wisdom, where it says, therefore, if you delight in thrones and scepters, O rulers over the people, then you need to honor wisdom so that you may reign forever. Okay, so if we give honor to wisdom, then she is going to grant us what she possesses, which is thrones and scepters to the rulers. Okay, so notice that all of those things have been created through wisdom and for wisdom. And those things are belonging to wisdom in some Jewish literature. We can also, there's a similar statement in Proverbs 8 verses 15 where it said, where wisdom, Lady Wisdom says, by me kings rule. You know, kings rule because of Lady Wisdom. Okay, so God made all things through his wisdom and for his wisdom, but wisdom is now embodied in Jesus. So that last little statement in verse 16, all things have been created through him and for him. Okay, again, taking things that were said about wisdom, all things have been created through wisdom and for wisdom, but wisdom now is embodied in Jesus. Jesus is the man that is walking around speaking and acting as the climax and embodiment of God's wisdom. Okay, remember, God is the creator. God created through wisdom, but all of these things were created ultimately for wisdom, who is now embodied in Jesus. Okay, verse 17, he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Okay, well, Lady Wisdom was before all created things, giving her, again, that position of prominence. Okay, remember I talked about how the firstborn in a family, in a Jewish family, is a position of prominence. Okay, so Proverbs 8 verse 22 says, Yahweh possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. So wisdom was before all of God's works. And the book of Sirach, first 4 verses, says that wisdom was created before all other things. Okay, clearly Paul is taking something that was said about wisdom and now applying it to Jesus, because being before all things is a position of prominence. And now we can typologically apply that position of prominence to the exalted Jesus. Okay, so Lady Wisdom was formerly said to hold all things together. Okay, 2 passages here, both of these from Wisdom of Solomon. The first one says, for wisdom, this is kind of an interesting statement, for wisdom is a kindly spirit, wisdom is a kindly spirit, but will not free blasphemers from the guilt of their words, because God is witness of the innermost feelings, and a true observer of their hearts, and a hearer of their tongues, because the Spirit, what's that Spirit? That's wisdom. The Spirit of the Lord is filled the world, and that which holds all things together knows what is said. So there we can see that wisdom is described as a kindly spirit that holds all things together. What do we see in Colossians 1? It is now Jesus, the current embodiment of wisdom, who holds all things together. And then in Wisdom chapter 7 and verse 24, it says, wisdom is more mobile than any motion. Because of her pureness, she pervades and penetrates all things. That's just another way of saying that she holds all things together, because wisdom is in all of God's creation. The preeminent position and the role of holding all things together are now found in the resurrected Jesus Christ. Okay, that's the point, okay? These things were formerly said about wisdom. Through typology, we can now use them and say that they now apply to Jesus. Verse 18. He is the head of the body, the church, the ruler, the firstborn of the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in all things. All right, being the head of the church body, Jesus acts as the preeminent head of the redeemed human race, okay? That's really important, okay? If Jesus is the head of the church, and if the church is God's redeemed people, then Jesus is the head of the redeemed human race. That's really important, okay? He is the most exalted human being ever, whoever has been and whoever will be, without question. All right. Now, some translations will say that he is the beginning. You might have a translation that says that, because I translate it, he is the ruler. Some of your translations will say he is the beginning. That's because the word, the Greek word arche, is ambiguous. It could mean beginning or it could mean ruler. But the word was formerly used up in chapter 1, verse 16 to refer to rulers in the plural, not to beginnings. So if it formerly in the Colossian hymn referred to rulers, it's probably likely here also referring to rulers. Okay, I'm not sure what it would mean to say he is the beginning, but it seems in the context to say if you're the head of the body, then you're a ruler. So I just think that that's much more likely. It's more consistent with how it's used earlier in verse 16. Okay, so it likely means ruler here as well. Okay, now by the way, Philo calls Lady Wisdom a ruler. We actually already looked at this passage, but I'm just highlighting the fact that that Philo calls heavenly wisdom the ruler. And now we're seeing that Jesus is now the ruler, taking something that was applied to wisdom and now applying it to Jesus. That's what Paul does. Now, as the firstborn from the dead, remember firstborn means first in time. Okay, Jesus, the firstborn of the dead, means he is the first person to be born, first person to be raised to immortality. So firstborn there means first in time. Okay, as the firstborn of the dead, he is able to come into the first place position. If you read the passage at the top, it says, as the firstborn of the dead, so that he himself will come to have first place in all things. Okay? If Jesus has to come to have first place in all things, that means that God has to promote him to that position. You see that how there's a transition there. Okay, as the one who is being raised from the dead, as the ruler, as the head of the body, as the church, God promotes and exalts Jesus to have first place in all things. Okay. And if God promotes Jesus to that first place position, it's clear that God still is supreme, because God is the one that promoted Jesus. Okay, so the statement here, the purpose statement there in verse 18, indicates that Jesus was exalted into his promotion. All right, means that in some sense, Jesus wasn't always in that first place position, because for millions of years, Jesus wasn't even born. I mean, Jesus wasn't even in existence, okay? But Jesus was born, he died, he rose from the dead, and God exalted him to this first place position, okay? This is not Paul teaching that there's God the Father and God the Son who are co-equal and co-eternal. No, it's God who exalts a dead human being to the first place position. It's the exaltation of a human being. It's what I call high human Christology. It's an exalted thing to say about someone who is a man. Verse 19, probably the most complicated passage we'll look at. It was the Father's good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him. Okay, you'll note up there that the NASB has the Father's in italics, because it's not there in the Greek text, because it just says that it was good pleasure for all the fullness to dwell in him. And so the question is, well, to whom does the good pleasure belong? Is it the Father? Is it God's? And so most translations will supply the Father or God, because you have to put something in there to make the sentence flow. So there's nothing difficult that's going on there, but it's God was pleased. It was pleasurable to him for all of whatever this fullness was to dwell in Christ. Okay, so something of the fullness of God was dwelling in Christ, and that's what we need to talk about. Okay, this passage indicates that God's fullness dwelt in Jesus. That much is clear. As we seek to understand how to understand this statement, that's a little redundant. Okay, I should use my words a little better. It might be helpful to note that the prayer in Ephesians 3 asks that, quote, you may be filled up with all the fullness of God. Ephesians 3:19, okay? Demonstrating that the post-biblical doctrine of incarnation is not in view. Okay, the point is, if in Colossians 1:19, the fullness of God is dwelling in Jesus, but we also pray in Ephesians 3:19 that the fullness of God will fill all of us up as well, we're not talking about God becoming a human being. We're talking about being filled with God's presence, experiencing God in a full way, having God dwelling in our midst, okay? So the important thing here is that what we're seeing said here about Jesus is said using the same terminology, using the same word fullness in Ephesians 3:19, as something that happens to us as well. And God is not incarnated in the midst of us as our Christian community, at least not in the post-biblical way. Okay, so we have to make sure that we're not reading Colossians 1:19 the way that they were reading it in the 4th and 5th centuries. Okay, I like to read it in the way that Ephesians reads it. Okay, however, we do know that God's wisdom has been portrayed in Jewish sources as embodying special human beings. Okay, I've talked about how the wives in Proverbs 31 were the embodiment of Lady Wisdom. I also talked about just briefly in a bullet point on that teaching that Simon the high priest was the embodiment of wisdom in the Jewish work Sirach, chapter 51. Sarah, Abraham's wife, was the embodiment of wisdom in the works of Philo. So it was pretty common in Jewish sources to say that wisdom could dwell into human beings. Similar language about dwelling can be found in regard to Lady Wisdom embodying godly human beings. In the book Wisdom of Solomon, it says that wisdom, as a personified female, will not enter a deceitful soul or dwell in a body enslaved to sin. So the presumption is that if wisdom is not going to enter or dwell into a deceitful person, then if you aren't deceitful, if you aren't sinful, then wisdom will dwell inside you. So, but here we're seeing the conversation that wisdom can dwell into human beings. And what we're seeing in Colossians is that Paul is taking the concept of wisdom dwelling, and now we're seeing that wisdom is now dwelling in Christ. Okay? God's fullness, I think it's the fullness of God's wisdom, which is now dwelling in Jesus, and the way that wisdom was dwelling in other godly human beings. Okay, so this verse is telling us what we have seen numerous times so far in this hymn, that Lady Wisdom's current embodiment is to be found in the crucified, risen, and exalted Jesus. For Paul, Jesus is wisdom become flesh. Okay, we have to take very seriously what is being said there in Colossians 1:19. All the fullness of God is dwelling in Jesus. Okay, we have to be able to say that and be comfortable saying that. And I think the best way of understanding that, based on everything we've seen so far, is that it's the fullness of God's wisdom that is now dwelling in Jesus. If you want God's wisdom, don't look to the book of Proverbs, don't look to God's law, don't look to Moses, look to Jesus. Verse 20. And through him to reconcile all things to himself, that's through Jesus to reconcile all things to God, having made peace through the blood of his cross. Through him, I say, whether things on earth or things in heaven. So reconciliation was a peacemaking act for those estranged and hostile to God. It's very important. It's very important that if we're talking about reconciliation, it's not just that, oh, I'm saved and I'm now a part of the family of God. You have to remember that prior to reconciliation, you were hostile to God. You were estranged to God. You were an enemy of God. But that reconciliation made peace. And if you have to make peace, it means that formerly there was something hostile. But Lady Wisdom offered the ways of peace. Proverbs 3:17 says that her ways are pleasant ways and all of her paths are peace. And Sirach chapter 1 verse 18 says the fear of the Lord is the crown of wisdom, who is making peace and perfect health to flourish. So wisdom is the maker of peace. And now we're seeing that Jesus in his death is the maker of peace. And the final mention of heaven and earth reconciled recalls that the heavens and the earth were created by God using the instrument of wisdom. So in Colossians 1:16, God created the heavens and the earth through his wisdom. And now we're seeing through his wisdom, who is now wisdom now embodied in Jesus, the heavens and the earth are now reconciled. Okay, so you have creation at the beginning and you have redemption at the end. Okay, well, it's just going to give a summary of all the little points that I made there. Here are all the places where wisdom's descriptions are used typologically of Jesus. And again, you have to understand these typologically, okay? So number one, wisdom is the image of God. We saw that in verse 15. Number two, wisdom is the firstborn of God's creation in verse 15. Number three, God created all things with Lady Wisdom, verse 16. The thrones and the rulers and the dominions and powers were made for Lady Wisdom, verse 16. Number five, Lady Wisdom was before all things, verse 17. Number six, Lady Wisdom upholds all things together, verse 17. Number seven, Lady Wisdom is likened unto a ruler in verse 18. Number eight, Lady Wisdom dwelt in human beings, verse 19. And number nine, the ways and the paths of Lady Wisdom were peace, verse 20. Every single verse of the Colossian hymn draws on Jewish depictions of Lady Wisdom and applies them typologically and in the poetry of a hymn to Jesus. It doesn't mean that when you read about wisdom in the Old Testament that was really Jesus back there. That would be to misunderstand typology. It's important that we have to read the Colossian hymn in terms of Lady Wisdom. So I'm shocked that people don't even mention wisdom whenever they teach this. They just seem to be respectfully ignorant of the facts. Okay, what's the point of all this? Why in the world are we even talking about this? Well, Paul's going to talk about this in Colossians. Jesus is the sum of God's wise teachings. That is wisdom. So the Colossian hymn appears to typologically depict Jesus Christ as the climax and embodiment of Lady Wisdom. But what is this theological move supposed to accomplish for the believers in Colossae? Okay, what is the point of the hymn? The opponents of the Colossians were Jewish, and internal evidence of the book of Colossians in the letter indicates that members of the Jewish synagogue were trying to dissuade the believers from their Christian truths. Okay, so if you're a believer in Colossae, you're there in that church, and you got Jews on the outside in the local synagogue that are trying to talk you out of the Christian truths in which you believe. Paul responds by practically promoting, that should be two words, there should be a space there, practically promoting Christ's teachings as the climax of God's wisdom. And he does this 5 times in 4 chapters, okay? So I want you to kind of see how Paul makes practical application of saying that Jesus is the place where you now find wisdom. Colossians 1, verses 9 through 10, Paul says, "For this reason also, since the day we heard of it, we have not ceased to pray for you, and ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will." Whose will? Okay. In all spiritual wisdom and understanding. Why? So that you will walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. That's the Lord Jesus. To please him in all respects, bearing fruit in every good work, increasing in the knowledge of God. Okay. So notice that if you're filled with God's wisdom, then you will walk in a manner worthy of Jesus. Notice how wisdom and Jesus are connected. Colossians 1:28, we proclaim him, admonishing every man and teaching every man with all wisdom. Why? So that we may present every man complete in Christ, okay? So if I teach you with God's wisdom, you will be whole, you will be mature in Jesus. Notice the connection there between wisdom and Jesus. That's in Colossians 1:28. About this one, Colossians chapter 2. I want you to know how great a struggle I have on your behalf and for those who are in Laodicea and for all those who have not personally seen my face, that their hearts may be encouraged, having been knit together in love and attaining to all the wealth that comes from the full assurance of understanding, knowing and a true knowledge of God's mystery. What is God's mystery? That's Christ himself, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. What's he saying there? In Jesus are hidden the treasures of wisdom. In Jesus is wisdom. Jesus is the embodiment of wisdom. That's clear. That's exactly what it's being saying there. Colossians 3:16, let the word of Christ dwell richly within you with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another. I mean, you can't talk about every time that wisdom shows up in the book of Colossians, it's relating practically to Jesus and his teachings and his word. Let me make this point clear because I still hear people say this incorrectly. The word in the New Testament, 99% of the time, is the gospel message. Okay, it's the good news. It's the gospel. It's the spoken word. The word of Christ is Jesus' gospel. The word is not the Bible. It's the gospel. We've got to stop talking about the Bible as if it's the word. Okay, talk about the scriptures. Say the holy writings. That's fine. But the word is the gospel. Okay, and then lastly in Colossians 4, Paul says, praying at the same time for us as well, that God will open up for us a door for the word. That's a door for opportunity for speaking the gospel. Notice, not the Bible, that's the word, the gospel. Why? So that we may speak forth the mystery of Christ, for which I've also been in prison, that I may make it clear in the way that I ought to speak. Conduct yourselves with wisdom towards outsiders, making the most of the opportunity. Notice there, when Paul is praying that an open door opportunity for him to speak the word is there, in the same line, in the same breath, he says, when you're speaking to outsiders, making the most of your opportunity, you need to conduct yourself with wisdom, okay? So speaking Jesus' gospel is how you conduct yourself with wisdom. 5 times there in Colossians. Colossians only has 4 chapters. We can see that Paul is practically applying wisdom to obedience to Jesus. So, applications. What's the point of everything we just looked at? Number 1, for the Apostle Paul, God's personified wisdom was a type of Jesus Christ. Very important. The crucified, risen, and exalted Jesus represented the position and function of Lady Wisdom. So, Paul composed the hymn of Colossians 1:15-20 to portray the victory of Jesus in terms of God's wise interaction with and instruction to his creation. To read the Colossian hymn and to not think of God's wisdom is to completely miss the point of what Paul was making. I have to make that point strong because there are too many people that try to teach Colossians 1 and they don't even mention wisdom. Number 2, we need to be comfortable with the truths presented in the Colossian hymn, okay? We got to get comfortable with this, okay? Many exalted things are said of Jesus Christ, but he is never identified with God or made God's equal. Jesus is the most exalted created being, the number 2 person in the universe. All creation was made for him. And by the way, if all creation was made for Jesus, that includes you and me. If we are a part of all God's creation, and if we were made for Jesus, how should we be living our lives? What should our obedience look like? Number 3, Jesus is not merely an exalted being embodying God's wisdom, okay? Wisdom in the New Testament doesn't end by being embodied in Jesus. For wisdom is now located in Jesus' teachings, not Moses' teachings, Jesus' teachings. Colossians is filled with practical ways in which its readers can seek after wisdom, namely by walking worthy of Jesus, growing in the instruction of the apostles, and speaking Jesus' gospel. Okay, So that is what is going on in Colossians 1. I admit to you, it's complex, it's complicated. That is probably the best that I'll ever be able to do on that. But if there's any questions or anything I can clarify, I would be happy to take the time to do that. So who has a question or a comment?
No, I don't want to be on camera. Hi, Dustin.
Hi.
Hi, this is Christina. I'm not for being on camera right now, but I had a question. First, I want to thank you for teaching on this. I've been meaning to email you about this section of scripture. It recently came up with my parents and some friends, and I had asked my cousin who's in seminary school for his second degree about it, and he had spent a considerable amount of time going over it with me, and so I guess, I'm sorry, Ichi was kind of distracting me there for a moment.
You're fine.
So anyways, with the thing about it being a hymn, I wanted to know, and you might have said this, but I just didn't hear from the other side of the room. Do you think that it is written as a chiasm with the ABBA form, or?
Yeah, there are parts of it that are arranged chiastically. Particularly, I think the strongest points are in verse 16. You have the things in the heaven and the things on the earth, and then the very last line in verse 20, you have the things on the earth and the things in the heaven. So I think that creates kind of a chiasm and inclusio for that. But I think what a lot of specialists are doing is that they're taking they're dividing the hymn up, and they're seeing that there's two stanzas, and you got one stanza that is relating to creation and one stanza that is relating to redemption, and they have equal lines going down talking about the same thing, often using the very same words, and then you have a transitionary part in the middle. It's complex because many of us are not experts in Greek hymns, but it's just, I'm not sure if that helps you or not.
Okay, well, I was just wondering, and then because that was something that we had found, and then like my cousin had gone to Oxford Biblical Studies, and like to their website, and on there they also bring up about Christ and wisdom. I'm so sorry. My dad is now playing with Ichi, which I don't know why. Dad, don't do that. Don't do that, please. I'm so sorry.
You're fine.
I'm very and so they bring up with Oxford Biblical Studies about Christ and wisdom, and but they also brought up, and this was a part I was kind of wondering about, that I'm sorry, I'm finally getting to also, is that they were, and I don't know if there's a good answer for it or not, but they were mentioning that like verses 16 B, C, D, and E through verses 17 were possibly like added in to the hymn, that it wasn't a part of the original hymn, is a possibility. Is that something you've come across, or do you have any thoughts on that? And there's something that, that maybe someone added it in to make a more of an emphasis on Christ's position. and that they did it like in the form to make it chiastic.
Okay, so the logic behind that is that so scholars would, it's not saying that they added to the text in Colossians as if like the Bible's been altered. The
Right.
suggestion here is that a lot of these scholars think that they see these hymns and they ask the question, okay, is this something that Paul created, or is Paul taking a previously written hymn, perhaps about wisdom by herself, and now maybe adding a couple of lines in there to make it about Jesus?
Right.
The point is, there's no way we could really answer that question, because how could we know? How do we know if Colossians 1:15-20 was all written by Paul, like completely in his mind, or if it was formally written about wisdom and put that in there? All that we can say is that the text that we have itself is, as it stands, arranged with that stands about creation and that stands about redemption. So I'm aware that people have those questions. I just don't know if we could really even give an answer to it that's definitive. But I don't think that's impossible.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Tell your dog I said hello.
Okay.
Okay. I'm going to go to John, and oh my gosh, look at all these questions. Okay.
Yeah, we got a lot of questions, so I'll keep it very brief, and you don't have to necessarily totally answer this. It's probably too big to take too much time. So, the other way, and I don't know if this is a typical way. I mean, I've heard this way of addressing this in a Christology setting, is to address it from the standpoint that this is talking about the new creation, not the old creation, right? And that's always seemed to make a lot of sense to me. Now, in what you've presented, there's a lot of great evidence clearly for some language and Paul making reference to wisdom. And you said something I didn't take the time to write it down. I'm hoping it's actually written in your stuff. I want to capture it as a quote, because I think it's a really great quote that Paul is basically saying that Jesus has become God's wisdom, and so that if you are seeking wisdom, you need to look to Jesus for that, right? I think that's really great. So I can definitely see that in here, but it seems like there is quite a bit of new creation stuff going on here, the firstborn among the dead and everything like that. And I'm just wondering if there's a way of bringing those two concepts together, that he is talking about new creation in the sense that Jesus is the beginning of the new creation, all that kind of stuff, but utilizing all of this wisdom language to bridge that gap. So again, that's a lot to probably to deal with. So I'm not expecting.
Yeah. Well, it's important to see that, again, I put up at the very beginning those two separate stanzas. Okay. And the second one was, I like to call redemption. I don't want to say new creation, because they're related, but it seems to be more about redemption and reconciliation and peacemaking. But the first one is clearly about creation. And when it says all things were created, that's the normal way that biblical writers talk about God being the creator. Okay. And again, all the references, when it's referencing wisdom in those places, are talking about the original creation. And so we can't just get away from that. So I don't like to say it's about new creation. It's about creation and redemption, and the underlying theme is that it's all about wisdom, which is now found in Christ. I just think biblical Unitarians have struggled to accept that the first part is about creation, because they don't see the wisdom connections. They haven't wrestled with that. They haven't followed along Paul's argument in that particular point. And I think because of that, they've struggled to understand how this passage works. But again, it's because they don't recognize typology and they don't understand how poetry works in hymns. So I want to be able to just take it seriously for what it says. and make sure it's all that. I would also point out too that when Paul does talk about new creation, the new creation, he specifically tells us it's new creation. 2 Corinthians 5:17, he says, if you're in Christ, you are new creation. And in Galatians 6:15, he says, there's neither Jew nor Greek, we're just all new creation. So whenever Paul wants to tell us about new creation, he will qualify it as the new creation. He doesn't qualify verses 15, 16, and 17 as new creation, the way that he characteristically does. So I think it's the basic creation, which is the basic way anyone would read it. So, okay. Oh man. Okay. So I'm looking at all these comments and I want to do that, but I also want to get to communion. Let's do this. Okay. I'll take two more comments. We'll do communion, and then I'm going to stay later if anyone else has questions, and I want to make sure that I can answer those as well. So let me get, I think I saw Tony and then I saw the Pereiras, but I'll stay after. And if anyone else has any questions, I promise that I'll make sure to do that, but I want to be respectful of everyone's time and the promise to do communion. So go ahead, Tony.
I'll make it quick, Dustin. Well, first, when I was a Trinitarian, I obviously viewed this as Christ was God and the creator, because that was how I was taught, and that's how I read it and all that jazz. And then when I abandoned the Trinitarian viewpoint and saw God as one and Jesus as human Messiah, I saw it as a creation, like you were mentioning earlier. I think you thought that way in the past as well. And I sat down with the pastor of my church, and that was not an easy conversation, because he is, ironclad that this is proving that Jesus is God and part of the creation and all that. And I guess what I'm really trying to articulate is that we really have to get our act together as far as the wisdom aspect. So we have to settle it in our hearts and understand that well, so we can explain that, because there's a lot of, it's not a 5-minute answer to share with people on this, because you're gonna have to, we got to be really strong in our understanding in this mindset, and it makes sense. It's just right now I'm framing it in my mind, it makes sense, but there's a lot of rooms that need to be filled and need to get put a lot more meat on the bone so I can explain it and be confident when I'm talking about. So it's really just a comment, I suppose, but it's not an easy conversation and not easily to share, especially here. I believe in one God, and yet it's hard to collect and process, and I get it, but I don't really get it yet. So I guess it's up to me to study and understand and process.
Yeah, no, and I sympathize with that. I get it. Like, it's if someone asked me for one time, I think it was a month ago, I think it was Josiah. It was like, hey, what do you think about Colossians 1? I'm like, you want me to give a 1-minute answer on that? Like, I can't do that. Like, but here's what I'd say 2 things. I think we could all agree with what is said in 2 Peter, that, hey, Paul, our brother Paul, says some things that are kind of confusing at times. We could all give a hearty amen to that. The second thing that I would say is again, just remembering that Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 10, the way that he understands the relationship between Jesus and wisdom is through typology. Okay? So the things that are said here should not be read woodenly literal. That's not how you interpret typology. Right. Typology is about relating one to another, as in Adam is a type of Christ. Adam is not Christ. They're not equated. They're not equal. Jesus isn't exactly wisdom. Wisdom is now found in Jesus.
And so we know that in our natural lives. We get that, the typology.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
And
here we abandon it.
Well, you have to, like I said, Paul is much more intelligent than we give him credit for. He is a very, very detailed thinker. So maybe going back and looking at some of these details will help solidify that. I still learn little nuances of this all the time. And I think, as you pointed out, I've even changed my position on this in the last 10 years. So, okay, go to the prayers, and then we're going to do communion. But thanks for your question.
Yeah, Dustin, I have a question on verse 16. And in King James, of course, it says, "For by him were all things created." And then end of verse 16, all things were created by him. So my question is, like, instead of by, you're saying a better translation is through him or in him. What would that really mean?
Yeah, so by him is wrong. That's the thing. It's like I don't think you're going to find that in modern translations anymore. It's just the preposition in, epsilon ni, means in, like in, like in the sphere of. Okay, so saying that it means that God created in or with. It also be translated as with like it's an instrumental thing. It would be like, I wrote a letter with this pen right here, or in this pen. Okay, I'm the writer. The pen is not the writer. The pen is the instrument with which that I write. So Colossians 1:16 is saying that all, like, in wisdom or with wisdom, all things were created by God. And now it's saying, now it's in Jesus, all things were created by God. But again, it's the by in the Old King James is wrong. I'm going to flat out say that it's not even a matter of debate, really. Like, nobody's going to argue that right now. It's God is a creator, but God is doing it instrumentally through the agent of his wisdom, which is now found in Jesus.
Interestingly, the New American Standard is translating it by as well.
But they have a footnote that says it's in.
Oh, it's not, in YouVersion, they don't include the footnote. But what's so funny about it is that just a few words later, you have in the heavens, same word in, epsilon nu, and they translate it in. So you can see a little bit of bias going on, I think, in the translation.
Yeah. The same thing as in ESV, it says by, but in the notes below it says in.
Yeah, that's for the people that don't read the notes, or they only pull it up on their phone. So again, it's in him. And again, the way to understand that is just as we saw in the passages, Psalm 104, verse 24, Proverbs 3:19. Those are super important passages to show how God creates in or with his wisdom. So, okay, I'll answer the rest of the questions after we do communion. For those watching this, hopefully this has been helpful to you. If you got questions, you can write in, and we'd love to have you in virtual fellowship. Check out the description below if you'd like to get in touch with us. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.